journalist would do, and in fact what any honourable journalist would do. This precedent means that any of you in this room, for publishing classified US information, truthful information about the United States, could face prosecution and extradition to the United States for having published that information. That is a terrifying precedent. I think we also need to think about why we are treating Julian's case any different to how we would consider what would happen if this was a British journalist or one of you in this room. What signal does the United States and the UK, by cooperating with this request, send to the rest of the world, to countries like China and Russia? How would we react if one of you published truthful information about Saudi Arabia and then faced an extradition request to Saudi Arabia to face prosecution for having published that material? There would be outrage. A few words, finally, before we open to questions, about the extradition proceedings, which are due to open next week. Obviously, we can't get into the detail of the arguments, but a few words on what you can expect. We will finally be hearing the case of the United States against Julian Assange after almost 10 years of a criminal investigation. You can expect to hear arguments about the political nature of the offence for which he's been charged and the substance, the politicisation of his case. You can also expect to hear concern being raised about the free speech issues that I've just outlined for you here and the unbalanced nature of the US-UK treaty. It's important to remember that Julian faces a long legal process. His health has deteriorated significantly since 2010. He's been under some form of restriction on his liberty since 2010. These proceedings are likely to take many years and raise fundamental questions for all of you. So I think it's important that we remember what this case means, not just for Julian Assange, but for every single person in this room.
Thank you very much. If I can kick off the questions with one thing. The Ansakoulas case and the refusal of extraditing Ansakoulas back to this country, has that given you hope for Julian Assange, given that it could be, maybe, I don't know, but used as a precedent? Are you going to be using that at all in the arguments? I know that there are things that you can't say, but I think a lot of us are wondering whether that could be a hopeful sign.
I think the case is an important demonstration of the imbalanced nature of the US-UK extradition treaty. That the US is refusing to extradite someone who is accused of having killed a British teenager in circumstances where the UK seemed ready and willing to extradite a publisher who has won numerous journalistic awards for having published information is a pretty stark contrast.
Thank you. Shall we take maybe 2 or 3 questions? If you want to direct your question to somebody, just say it and remind us who you are and who you work for. I'll start with Daniel, and then you and you.
Daniel from the Swedish radio. I was just wondering if you could give us the facts. There are 5 days this week, and then there are some weeks in May. When do we know if there will be an extradition? Whether he will be extradited or not? And can you appeal that? And just give us the
okay. Yes.
Hi, I'm Julian from Jennifer, thank you for walking through with your thoughts on how there is much of the language in the indictment where it touches on the journalistic activity. Can you walk us through your response to the language in the indictment that cites Assange's communications with Chelsea Manning about the computer hack and how the Corinthians say that he's handling that so far? So it's so both your argument that he did not commit hacking. How did you manage to respond to that language in the indictment?
And Claudia? Yeah. Yes.
Questions.
Sorry, who are you and who you work for?
In the last 2 months of taking more concerns about Julian's health, what is his status, his condition at the moment, as anybody said? And in court, you guys have brought in Spanish cases evidence of nominees in the case. Has there been any progress in that for the first week of the hearings, or expect to know more?
Okay, who wants to take those? You, Jen, Kristin?
You want to start with legal?
Sure.
Yeah.
Just briefly, so there'll be 1 week of hearings starting on Monday, the 24th of February. You'll hear largely the opening from the US and our defence response, including some legal arguments. There'll be a further few weeks of hearings in May, at which the evidence will be heard. The Assange extradition team has already served more than, and already indicated in court there'll be more than 20 witnesses, more than 15 of which will be giving live evidence. We will find out at some point after that whether there's a decision to extradite, and of course we expect an appeal either way, and the process could take a number of years and find its way in the UK Supreme Court. There was another question about the indictment.
Yeah.
I'm not going to get too much into the facts of that, and certainly not how it will be presented in court, but of course, and perhaps Kristin can speak more to that, this is really a question of the typical kinds of communications that a journalist would have with their source.
Yes, I mean, what is described there in the alleged discussion that you referred to is simply a speculation of access to material that the source had access to anyway, but in such a manner that the source could be saved. So there's no hacking there's no hacking allegation in the nature of how it's presented. That's what I said at the outset. Of course, you could call an expertise in computer science to actually just tell you that. And many have probably done so. There was a discussion about the outcome and the appeal. You didn't mention that, but it is going to drag on. I mean, late next summer, early fall, probably will be the result from magistrate court. We assume the decision will be appealed, whichever way it will go. So that will add, another year in the Supreme Court. So this could be a very, very long battle. The extradition cases, the previous one that have been high profile, have taken years to finalize. There was a question about Julian's health. Yes. I think I saw him about 10 days ago. He has improved, and thanks to the pressure from his legal team, mostly behind the scenes, from the general public, and amazingly actually from other inmates in Belmarsh prison who have on 3 occasions petitioned the governor to get him out of isolation. So there's more humanity actually among hardened criminals in Belmarsh prison than when you find on the outside. He was released out of that isolation or de facto isolation in the health wing and has now better access to his lawyer, even though it's not sufficient today. Limited telephone service. He still doesn't have any functioning computer. But the outrage is this only happened about 2 weeks ago. So since April 11th, he's been having to, as I tried to prepare for the case of his life, defend his life under absolutely absurd circumstances. It's only, 2 months since the lawyers could actually leave papers with him. So this is simply absurd. And don't forget that we have a person here who is on remand. He is innocent. Yeah. He has served this ridiculously long sentence for skipping bail, which we, of course, argue was simply using his protected rights under international law to seek asylum. So he's an innocent man sitting in a maximum security prison here in Britain, trying to prepare for his defense in the most important case of his life and for journalism in general. So it's unacceptable how this has been progressing.
And thank you for raising this Spanish case. Oh, yeah. So many of you in the room will be aware, but there is ongoing criminal proceedings brought by Julian Assange in Spain in respect of what we have learned about the fact that the security company inside the Ecuadorian embassy was recording all of our meetings, including our legally privileged meetings with Julian Assange, including his meetings with doctors, and were handing that material over to the United States. This is obviously a fundamental breach of his right to a defence, including spying on my meetings with him, in which we were discussing his legal defence and other legal matters associated with WikiLeaks. This is a serious breach of legal privilege and a serious breach of Julian's rights to a defence. These facts will of course be relevant and are going to be raised in the context of the extradition proceedings, and go to and speak to the abusive process that Julian Assange has faced to date and the abusive process that we would expect from any US prosecution.
Thank you. Shall we take some questions from that side? Catherine, you and Jorg. Catherine.
Catherine Goodwill, German media. I'm just wondering, the perception of Julian Assange and the case is very different in the US and in the UK, by the British public, by the media, and it is, let's say, on the continent. Can you elaborate on that? Why do you think that actually is not the case?
Okay. Let's take a second question. Yep.
From the USA Today. I was wondering if you could give some thoughts about what you think might happen in the case.
Speak up just a little bit, Kim, sorry.
You might give some thoughts about what you think might happen if you win the case. So Assange is a prisoner, try to go back to Australia, perhaps the purpose there. He's going to relate to the new relationship because of the United States. So just a general
Assuming you win, and you're...
Marcus Heffinger,
Marcus.
Zeitung. Two small questions, if I may. One, when did he serve out his sentence for skipping bail? Because as far as I remember, he was sentenced to close to 1 year, and that would have been in May, I think. And second, about his conditions in jail, can you say a little more? What kind of communication has he access to? And does he get exercise and stuff like that? I mean, physical condition.
Who wants to start? Kristen?
He has limited access to telephone in prison, if I just start the last question. I'm not fully, I don't think he has access to any exercise facility, anything like that. I don't think he has access to exercise facilities or of that nature. Just to outline sort of the restriction he was under until just 2 or 3 weeks ago. The corridors were emptied whenever he had to go from one place to another. So I mean, there was everything was done to limit his interaction with other inmates in the prison. That has now slightly changed. He is in a ward with 40 or 50 inmates. So there's 40 or 50. So there is some relaxation now.
Yeah, sorry, we seem to have a few problems with your volume. Marcio, can you just turn it up a little bit if you can?
Sorry, the sentence.
The sentence, he served that out in I think September 20th or around that time, late September. Even though it was 50 weeks, he served half of that time, which is not normal. So I mean, formally he had finished serving that sentence in late September.
If he wins.
Yes, I mean, if he wins, I mean, I would assume the opposition would appeal, so that would prolong the process. I don't know whether they, we just assume that will happen. About the speculation about him being sort of locked in here, not being able to go to Australia, maybe you can tell us a little bit about the legal situation there and if there's any possibility of
well, on the trial, I'm an ex-infantry officer, not a lawyer, but I'm sure Jen will correct me. There is a concern that if Julian succeeds here in the UK and defeats the attempt by the US to extradite him to the US, he might then be deported to Australia. The concern there is that the agreement between Australia and the US is much more loose than the agreement between the UK and the US. And that's why it's so important. And in fact, when I say more loose, I understand that although you cannot be, well, in theory, you can't be deported from the UK to the US on political grounds. You could be deported from Australia to the US on political grounds. And that's why it's so important for the Australian government to come out and express its support for its citizen. Because until the Australian government does come out publicly and say it supports Julian Assange and it recognises that a great injustice is being done, until it recognises that what's going on here is a journalist, or at least a publisher, facing jail for doing his job, until we get that assurance from the Australian government, we will have no comfort that the Julian Assange matter will be ended by him coming to Australia.
Your question was an excellent one. So the outcome of any proceedings, if extradition is refused from this country, does not protect Julian from extradition from any other country in the world, only here. That means he is at risk if he travels, and is at risk even if he returns home to Australia, which again underlines the importance of the United States withdrawing this request. This is, of course, part of the Trump administration's war on journalism, an administration that considers the media, all of you, the enemy of the people, and stopping this in its tracks in the United States is the best possible option.
And there was a question from the difference. Why is it so different on the continent?
Different perception. Well, I think each and every one of you probably would be better to answer that. Actually, I mean, where does public perception come from? It comes from media and how Julian and WikiLeaks are being portrayed in the media. There has been quite a level of hostility in the UK media. I find that even though that is gradually changing, but the media environment has been different. You know, there was a change, of course, a few years ago in relation to the election in 2016, in the tone of media coverage of WikiLeaks and Julian at that point. So, I mean, it is being guided somewhat by the media, how public perception is. So, I mean, there is a huge responsibility that you all have, and we journalists have, in fairness and objectivity in reporting, and that's all we ask for. There was mention here, I wanted to add about the Spanish case, the Spanish spy, which has only been emerging in the last few weeks. It has been reported in El País to some length, and it is remarkable what has happened. Spying on legally privileged communication in the embassy, and bear in mind who bankrolls this. That was Adelson, the biggest financial backer of the Republican Party, and Donald Trump. And the person that Mike Pompeo has now reportedly gone to ask him to bankroll his attempt to get a seat in the Senate next fall. So that was financed by this casino magnate, the biggest single financial backer of the Republican Party, and the material handed over to U.S. intelligence. That only came to light in the last few months. And that came to light after Saeed Javid, then Interior Minister here, Home Secretary, signed off on the extradition. So, I mean, in my mind, there should be ample new evidence to consider on the political front, because this is so outrageous, for, as you mentioned, for Boris Johnson to reconsider, to basically take back that sign-off on the extradition. One would consider, and it came up last week in question time, Prime Minister question time, and Jeremy Corbyn asked Boris Johnson about Julian Assange. He didn't want to go into specific, but he said, "I'm committed to protect journalists and whistleblowers." Now, this is a very good opportunity to basically put it to him, and maybe you will, and your conservative friends, to show that in action what that really means.
Can I just say on the perception issue that I know it's not the question you asked, but in Australia and perhaps elsewhere as well, there's two perceptions, or should I say myths out there. One, Julian Assange is not a journalist. That's been raised before by others on the panel. I think he is. Australian journalists think he is. They gave him a Walkley Award. But does it really matter whether he's a blogger, a journalist or a publisher? The issue is free speech and the right to publish. The second is the inference that he's a hacker and has somehow reached into the US to do something illegal. He hasn't. That is the facts. He hasn't. Someone reached out and gave him information. So these myths absolutely need to be busted. And more than that, to go to the other question about what might happen in Australia, as Andrew said, there is that risk that there could be another extradition case heard in Australia. We don't want that. And I've got to say, I'm firmly of the belief now that our extradition treaty with the US needs to change, and there'll be views. I'm a member of the government in Australia. There'll be views within the government that I put forward. We need to ensure that our extradition treaties with any country, no matter who it is, protects freedom of speech and press freedom. They are fundamentals. And I've got to tell you, we rejected a treaty with China, and the government that I was part of was considering that a few years ago, and I was part of a group of backbenchers that severely opposed that for those reasons. So the same reasons with China should apply to our extradition treaties with other countries, including the US.
Can I I'll take this opportunity to make the point that yes, there's a broad range of views in the community and among officials about Julian Assange. And over the years, there's been all sorts of allegations, innuendos, stories, disinformation. Please remember, the US extradition is based on a very narrow snapshot in time and on very narrow matters. And we've got to stay focused on the facts and what the extradition is about. The extradition is simply and only to do with WikiLeaks revelations during 2010 and 2011. It is only to do with the release of information about the war in Iraq, about the war in Afghanistan, about the circumstances in Guantanamo Bay, and the embassy cables, I understand. That's all it is about. So if we are to treat Julian Assange fairly and justly, we have to look at the merits or otherwise of the US complaint simply about those matters. And when you drill down you boil it down to its very essence, that's all it's about. And the challenge for people like George and me, and I suggest for the media, is to educate the public that that's all it's about. And when you consider that, all Julian Assange and WikiLeaks were doing was releasing information about those matters in the public interest as a publishing house, as a journalist, and as George says, Julian Assange is a Walkley Award winner in Australia. So many people regard him as a journalist. And when you drill down that narrowly, you really can see in very sharp contrast what the offence or what the injustice is.
Thank you. Let's take 3 questions now from that side. I've seen you were there. Any more questions from that side? Gosh, you're shy. We're going from then to you and Paul. So let's start with you. Sorry, I don't know your name.
Hi, I'm Martin Seal from Australian Associated Press. I just wanted to ask, Gareth Pearce in court mentioned that due to Julian's lack of access to his lawyers, it might be a case of a judicial review. I just wondered why that wasn't going ahead now, or why you decided not to go ahead with that, and how much access Julian has had with his lawyers to go over this case since he was first arrested.
Okay, shall we take the other 2? Benedict, please.
Benedict Pavio, France 24. Hi, John.
Hi.
What is Julian Assange's frame of mind currently? How is he looking at next week? Also, will he be attending in person every day, or will he be testifying?
Thank you. And Paul.
Paul from the Global Mail Canada. Presumably the hearing now is about extradition. It's not about the merits of the case per se. Canada is facing a similar type of situation with Huawei executive China doesn't want to extradite to the U.S. shipping off in Canada. But are you really saying that U.S. courts can't handle this case? The U.S. would not get a fair hearing in U.S. courts? Are U.S. courts the same as China and Saudi Arabia?
Which one do you want to start with?
First, we had the question about access.
Yes.
So our access to Julian has been consistently either delayed or difficult, whether it's about our ability to get prison visits, the time we have with him when we get the prison visits. Often I'll sit there for half an hour or longer into a 2-hour visit because the guards haven't brought him down yet. So what should be a 2-hour visit is significantly constricted. We were not allowed to hand him papers in prison for a very long time, and as you mentioned, as a result of the work of Gareth Pearce, some of those restrictions were lifted and we're now able to hand him papers. There's also been difficulties of access to a computer for him to be able to prepare what is an incredibly complex and complicated case with a huge amount of evidence. So it has materially affected his ability to be able to prepare this case and properly defend himself. There was a question about the prospect for a fair trial in the United States. We are obviously very concerned about the politicisation of this case, and we say that he ought to benefit from the First Amendment. That's part of the reason why this extradition request is so dangerous and what the US...
Yeah.
Sorry, I speak quite quietly.
Okay, let's try.
I was answering the question about the process in the United States. We are obviously very concerned about the politicisation of this case and the prospects of whether he would get a fair trial in the United States, including arguments that have been mooted by people like Mike Pompeo that the First Amendment does not apply to Assange and to WikiLeaks. These are very serious matters, which is why we don't think that he ought to have to face this process at all in the United States.
And there was a question about the state of mind. Do you want to do this, Christian?
Yeah, maybe I'll add a little bit to the question about fair trial. And I think it's absolutely impossible that he will get a fair trial in the United States. Impossible. And one of the reasons is that he will be tried with a jury pool of people very likely associated directly or indirectly with the establishment. The courtroom is a 10-minute drive from CIA headquarters, State Department. It's the heart of the community where his reputation has been sort of tainted in the public mind. It's impossible to get a fair trial. And another issue that pertains to the First Amendment protection, Jennifer said that Mike Pompeo said he's not a journalist, so he is not, he doesn't, has no right to First Amendment protection. But even more so, this is being argued in submissions to the court, and I think I'm okay with disclosing it here, that about 10 days ago, the last submission by the United States to the court here, into the hearing, it is maintained that it could be argued by the lawyers on behalf of the United States that foreign nationals do not have First Amendment protection, even if they're journalists. And this is outrageous. This is a shocking revelation, especially to foreign press here. Everybody in this room, actually, if you're a non-US citizen, as a journalist, we're now facing that sort of theory that foreign nationals, foreign journalists do not have First Amendment protection in the United States. At the same time that they claim extraterritorial reach, that they can hunt down journalists anywhere in the world, foreign nationals, and bring them to the United States without this protection. That is chilling.
This goes to my point, Kristen. I mean, I made the point about him being extradited before and going into the US. The fact is that he's an Australian citizen, that a British court is deciding on whether he should be extradited or not to another foreign country. And there's something inherently wrong with that, as far as I'm concerned. But the second issue really is to do with the extraterritorial nature of the alleged crime. I mean, what does the law of America or any other country now apply right across the world? Sure, if you're actually really hacking, if you're doing something reaching into a country, there is an issue. But when you're just simply receiving information, how is that with the crime. How can you commit a crime when you're not even present in that country to commit it? So that's my issue. The issue of fairness in those courts is another matter, and I've got some doubt about this, spy court that he'll probably face. But these are the essential issues. He's our guy. He's an Aussie. What's a foreign court doing trying to extradite him to another foreign nation? What's a foreign nation doing targeting an Australian journalist like this, telling us that he's committed a crime when he hasn't even been in that country to break that law? It's ridiculous.
Sorry, the frame of mind and is he testifying?
Well, in terms of his frame of mind, I want to recognise that we have Julian's father in the room, John Shipton, who is best placed. If I shout, perhaps you can hear it. In terms of Julian's frame of mind, I think the best person to be able to speak to it, I would also like to recognise that John Shipton, his father, is here with us in the room, who visits him regularly in prison and has been in Europe doing advocacy efforts on his behalf. So I think he's best to speak to on that front.
Sure. And testifying? Sorry, will you be present?
He will be present in court, and you'll have to wait to see.
Do you want him to speak? Or do you want him to speak, John?
Maybe afterwards. Okay, next set of questions, and then I think that we can wrap it up. I'll do Julie, Maria, and I don't know you, but you at the end.
Julie, freelance journalist from China.
Really speak up a lot, because otherwise...
Julie Zhou, freelance journalist from China. My question is about, actually we discussed the focal point about the definition of journalism. So do you think it should meet two conditions? One is for public interest, but who can judge is for public? Is it from the will or from the effect? And the second one is that the method should be legal. And will the government have the authority to define if the journalist or whistleblower, they need to use a legal method to get access to information if they public in like New York Times or other media, is it okay? So I think the focal point is this, not just for Julian Assange case, in the future, how will WikiLeaks continue to work? Will you prepare for next case similar to Julian Assange?
Okay, that's one question. Maria?
Maria from the Russian news agency. Just wanted to clarify one thing. As I understand, as you said, the whole process will take a few years. So could you please clarify where will Julian Assange be during this time? I mean, of course, he's in concurrent imprisonment limited time. So what will happen after that? Will be there in bail hearings, or how is it going to be?
And the third question, you, yeah.
Yes, William Goodman from Confused Weekly. Are you able to comment on the extent of the surveillance that was carried out in the law and amnesty and its impact on legal professional privilege, and then what that means legally for the extradition and whether Julian Assange was trial in the US?
Thank you very much. Answered that. Let's start with
the question about who is a journalist and the public interest issue. I mean, we live in the changing world of journalism, and when I started 30 years ago, there were still some leftovers of typewriters in the editorial office. Things are changing fast, but we don't have to speculate about it. I mean, at least the Union of Journalists should be able to recognize who is a journalist and who is not. Julian Assange has been a journalist, a part of the MEAA, the Australian Journalists Union, for more than a decade. He is recognized by the International Federation of Journalists, which actually has supported him and are outraged by what is now happening. So, who is to decide who is a journalist? Well, I can simply answer this. I do not assess that I have to go to the power holders, to Mike Pompeo, to Donald Trump, to Boris Johnson, to get permission to call myself a journalist. That's not where you seek that definition. That is not right. Would not be a healthy world to live in for any journalist.
There's been a problem of this. who defines what a journalist is? Do you need a degree? I mean, I was a former journalist actually before I went into politics. Do you need to work for an agency? So therefore, does it mean that a freelancer isn't a journalist? You know, what are we now prescribing? There's going to be some government body that sets up you know, you've got to report if you're actually a reporter. It's nonsense. You know, there's citizen journalists out there that run blogs online. They're journalists. You know, you're quite clearly a journalist, as are the people that work for WikiLeaks. You report on matters that are of vital information to the public. So it's a nonsense, this story about whether he's a journalist or not.
Can I add that as important as the definition of journalism is and how central it will be to the court case, I think, there's a bigger, more important issue is, did he do the right thing?
Yeah.
You know, he did the right thing. You know, information came into his possession establishing US misconduct around the world, including hard evidence of war crimes, and he released it in the public interest. He did the right thing, and that's got to amount to something as well.
And if I may add, basically, on the journalist question that I found partly amusing, even though it's a very serious matter, that the High Court here has basically defined Julian as a journalist and WikiLeaks as a journalist organization. Other judicial bodies here, like the Information Tribunal, has acknowledged Julian as a journalist and WikiLeaks as a journalist organization. Last summer, in a dismissal of the case on the Democratic National Committee against WikiLeaks, the judge in New York acknowledged that Julian was a journalist and WikiLeaks a journalist organization, and actually added that what he was accused of there was perfectly protected First Amendment action. And finally, in a military intelligence report that was leaked to WikiLeaks and was published from 2009, WikiLeaks is called a journalist organization and Julian a journalist. So even in their own dark system, you know, they do acknowledge this, even though there's been a change of tune lately for political and propaganda purposes.
And there was a question on what's going to happen to him. Where is he going to stay over these years?
It's very likely because of the It's very likely as a result of the bail conviction that he will remain in prison. We've seen that several judges have denied him bail, but that's a matter that we'll keep under consideration and review. It's obviously not a happy prospect for him to be looking at a process that could take many years and remaining in prison when he's a publisher who's published information for which he's won awards.
Okay, let's the last three questions. I've seen you, and you at the back. So let's start with you.
Sorry, Al Jazeera. Thank you for the question. Just a natural concern here. Of course, there have been issues about, whether it's a journalist or not, and you're firmly establishing that for years. And of course, you're establishing that it is within that very strict time frame that you are going to be concerned with during the trial. Are you at all worried that the subsequent alleged actions by WikiLeaks, including the alleged hacking of the US Democratic Party, will be playing into this at all?
There was never any...
Christian, wait, let's take the three of them if you don't mind. Okay, got that. Lourdes?
Lourdes Gómez from the Spanish service of Spain. Could the extradition be granted just for one camp or charge, or needs to be held? And how much of a hinder public that the USA has, according to the treaty, doesn't need to present any evidence?
Okay, and then we had, no, not you, yeah.
From the Spanish agency, is there any danger that the case of Assange might become some sort of bargaining chip or political weapon with the negotiation of the trade deal between the United Kingdom and the US, and how could that be avoided?
Well, if I can start with you're still raising the question whether he's a journalist or not. He is a journalist. You know, I don't even want to debate that. It's just simply outrageous. And you talked about activities that have nothing to do with actually the extradition case, but you are wrongly depicting it. I urge you to get hold of the dismissal in the New York court last summer of the civil case filed by the Democratic Party against Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. It is a very good read. It is the most underreported media story of last year. There's barely been a mention of it, which is totally absurd. It's a very interesting story. It's a very interesting media story. The judge in that case said about the events that you were talking about that it was fully protected publishing activity under the First Amendment. People had the right to know what was going on behind the closed curtains of the biggest political parties right before the election. That's sort of verbatim what I was reading from the judge there. And he said, it doesn't even matter if the material that was in question was illegally obtained to begin with. It didn't change the fact that there's a fundamental right and public interest to publish it. So I urge you to read that. It's a very clear dismissal, and it was a dismissal with prejudice, so the case cannot be brought up in other jurisdictions in the United States. And as I say, it's one of the most underreported media stories of last year. It should be of interest to every journalist and to the public as well.
It's a shame that because of that, some on the left have actually abandoned Julian Assange, and we certainly see that in Australia at least. But it's absolutely right. I mean, those DNC, the Podesta files, public knowledge. He reported on it. It might have impacted upon Hillary Clinton, but so be it. That was what her campaign people were saying. And, the truth comes out.
In fact, if anything, the reporting of the DNC emails is further evidence that this is a journalist. He's a journalist, and WikiLeaks is an agency of journalism. That they don't pick and choose. They don't pick winners, pick losers. They don't take political sides. They publish information that comes into their possession that they think is in the public interest. I can't stand Donald Trump, but I think WikiLeaks did the right thing by publishing that information.
Not publishing that information would have been constitute a very serious bias, actually. And for some reason, I've been trying to fathom this among journalists. That it has been creeping into the circles of journalists that they should actually step back right before elections. I was raised under the assumption that journalists played a crucial role in the electoral process. They have, especially before elections, a duty to expose the facts about the political parties and the political individuals in question. Only a few weeks ago, WikiLeaks was publishing information about corruption in Namibia, in Africa, 2 or 3 weeks before the election. It was crucial to get the information out before the election because it implicated 2 government ministers who are now actually in jail facing corruption charges. So where did that sort of come into play, that journalists should stay away from elections? That is outrageous. I mean, that is simply our role to inform the public about the choices that they are faced with. And I hope you all agree.
Okay. Can he be extradited?
I think there was a question about... It's important to remember with the extradition process that this is not a full criminal trial, so the evidence is inherently limited. But I urge you all to wait and see how it's presented next week, because I think it's important, and I hope that through the presentation of the case that people will finally understand what this case is really about.
And can he be a bargaining chip in the future US-UK trade deal?
I have no idea. I've been following the case here of the horrible case that you mentioned at the outset here, the Harry Dunn case, which is it must be worrying when Mike Pompeo simply says, no, we are not going to hand over the person or the alleged killer of this young boy to face trial here for the alleged manslaughter. At the same time, Mike Pompeo is demanding the handover of Julian Assange. The disparity in this relation, the extradition relations between the two countries on the basis of a very disputed treaty, actually, which has been enforced, for less than 20 years, I believe. The disparity is I think, numerically, and please don't rely on me as a source, but I read this somewhere, that for every one American that is extradited to face trial here in the UK, 10 UK citizens extradited to the United States. So, I mean, there's something fundamentally wrong here, and it has been acknowledged by both sides of both parties here, both the Labour Party and by Boris Johnson in Parliament question time last week.
Okay, thank you. Before I thank my panelists, I just wanted to say that in the room there's John Shipton, who looks very much like Julian Assange, who can answer some questions, and then there is Joseph Farrell over there. Joseph, just wave, and he's the WikiLeaks ambassador and can also answer questions. I will keep here Jennifer and Kristin, and there is a list of interviews, so I'll inform you immediately if you've got one, and everybody else who doesn't have one-to-one interviews, if you can leave the room.
And just one note in closing, that our visiting MPs are going to be visiting Julian in prison today.
Yeah, now, very soon, after the end of this briefing. So thank you very much for being with us, all of you, and thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Hi, Caroline, good to see you. Yes, you do. I have a list, though, and
What the hell's going on with
just remind me who you are. Yes, hi there. Yes, fantastic.